Welcome to Lesson 10 of Hebrew 1 and 2 for Bright OT 500. Today we're going to be talking about the difference between strong and weak verbs. All verbs are classified as either strong or weak verbs. This relates to the actual root of the verb. A strong root will maintain all three letters of the root throughout all of its conjugations and inflections in the various stems of the Hebrew verb system. A weak verb, either because of the root itself, having only two consonants instead of three, or having one consonant that is reproducing itself as in a geminate, or because the consonant itself is weak and will disappear or change, will not remain the same throughout all of its various conjugations and inflections. Instead, the verb will look different at different times, making identification of the root more difficult, but not impossible. Before we move on, we need to clarify how we identify the various root letters in a verb. It is useful to use the verb pa'al, pei, ayin, lamed, to identify the three letters. Thus, the first letter of the root is the pei syllable. We can utilize this same nomenclature throughout all verbs regardless of the verb, referring to that first letter as the pei letter. The second letter, the middle letter, is the ayin letter. The third letter is the lamed letter. We can also use 1, 2, and 3 to identify the various parts of this root the same way. Thus, we might say that the third letter of this root is lamed. We might also say that the lamed letter of this root is lamed, which in this case, since we're using pa'al, is the case. We might also say that the second letter is ayin, or the ayin letter is ayin. We could say that the first letter is pei, or that the pei letter is pei. Thus, we could say that the first letter of a word is a guttural, or a one guttural, first letter guttural. We could also say that it's a pei guttural, or a pei aleph, also meaning that the first letter is a guttural or an aleph. Each of these can be used interchangeably to identify the first letters either using 1, 2, or 3, or pei, ayin, lamed. This will be important as we move forward, as the two systems will both be used. The first weak root that we will look at are first, second, and third gutturals, also known as pei, ayin, and lamed gutturals. Although remember that specifically we are within the kal weak verb stem, so even though changes take place in first, second, and third gutturals and other stems, this chart is specific to the kal stem. The first change that we see take place is that gutturals prefer compound schwas instead of vocal schwas. You can see it marked here on the chart where we would expect a vocal schwa in the strong stem. Instead, we have the compound schwa, the hatuf patak, in the weak stem. The second change has to do with two fs verbs in the third chet and third ayin verbs, and that is that the expected silent schwa under the third letter becomes a patak, and the accent stays on the second syllable rather than the last syllable or second to last syllable. The next weak root that we will look at are third aleph verbs, also called lamed aleph verbs, and these are those that have aleph as the third letter of the root. In these verbs, aleph will actually quiesce and will not take a vowel itself. Instead, it will serve as a helping letter, helping the long vowel of the previous letter, serving to make that vowel unchangeably long. Because of this, the patak that would have been expected lengthens to a kametz because there's no longer a schwa under that third letter to close the syllable. Dagesh line will also disappear from all of the subject endings. Third hey verbs are very similar to third aleph verbs or lamed aleph verbs, except that the hey will not just quiesce, it will drop completely. Most of the time, the hey as it drops will be replaced by a hirik yod, except in the three fs where it is replaced with a tav. Again, the dagesh line will disappear from the subject ending. Some verbs are what we call doubly weak, meaning that they have two weak letters and not just one. For instance, the verb ra'ah, to see, has an aleph, which is weak, as well as a hey, which is weak. So the aleph will take the compound schwas, the heys will drop and become tavs or hirik yods, the dagesh line will disappear completely. These rules make sense if we stop and think about them. We just have to remind ourselves that there are two sets of rules to follow, and not just one. Another type of weak verb root is the geminate root. We've also seen geminate roots when it comes to nouns. These particular verbs have a third letter that is the same as the second letter. There technically is no third letter. The second letter has reproduced itself. In some cases, the third letter will not appear at all, in which case there will be a dagesh forte in the second letter to represent that third letter that does not appear. This is the case in almost every type of geminate where that dagesh forte appears in the middle of the verb. It's important to recognize that this is a geminate because there are verb stems that will require a dagesh forte, but remembering that this is a geminate tells us that it's not because of the verb stem, it's because of the weak root. Another indication that we are dealing with a geminate is the appearance of a holem vav in the first and second person as the connecting vowel to the subject ending. In the two fs, tav will actually lose the schwa that is often the indicator of the two fs subject ending, so that a two fs verb looks just like a noun. Again, remembering our dictionary form and our vocabulary will remind us that this is a geminate and not a noun. In some cases, for instance, the weak 2 geminates here on the chart, will retain the accent on that second position in the 3fs and the 3cp instead of going all the way to the end of the verb. Instead, it exists in the second to last syllable. Biconsonantal verbs are almost identical to geminate verbs, with a few exceptions. For instance, a biconsonantal verb does not have a dagesh forte in the second letter because there is no third letter. Instead, biconsonantal verbs are often called hollow verbs because in the infinitive, a strong, unchangeable vowel will appear in the hollow space in between the two consonant letters of the stem. You will notice that this form still takes a patak under the first letter and still retains the accents on the second to last syllable in the 3fs and the 3cp. However, there is no holem vav in the second person and first person verbs, indicating that this is not a geminate but a biconsonantal verb. All of this information regarding geminate and biconsonantal verbs may seem overwhelming, so let me boil it down to a few steps to identify two-letter roots. First, is there a hirik yod that serves as the connecting vowel in the first or second person? Well, then the verb is a third hey verb. The hey will often appear in the third person, which will indicate as well that it's a third hey verb. If instead of a hirik yod there's a holem vav in the first and second person as the connecting vowel, then the verb is a geminate. Is there a patak under the first letter in the first or second person, but no holem vav? Then the verb is biconsonantal. If there was a patak but there was a holem vav, then we would be back to number 2, that the verb is indeed a geminate. The other question to ask ourselves is related to the accent. Is the 3cp accented on the first syllable? If it's accented on the first, then the verb is biconsonantal or perhaps a geminate. If it is accented on the second syllable, then it is a third hey verb, because in a third hey verb, the accent goes to the end of the word. Hopefully, this will make identifying the two-letter roots a little easier. Over the next few charts, I'm going to work through some verbs that look funny. However, these verbs follow the normal rules for geminates, biconsonantals, and weak verbs that have already been discussed. For instance, the verb natan ends in a nun, which can often be weak. This is called a third nun or a lamed nun, weak stem. In this particular case, the nun assimilates into the tav or the nun of the subject ending. We've already seen this in strong verbs, and here we see it in weak verbs. In the second verb, haya, the hey on the end of the verb will drop. However, because it becomes a heroic yod, this verb looks funny because there is yod, yod. However, this is perfectly normal. A third he will have heroic yod in the first and second person. We also know that he is a guttural, so at the beginning of the word, he will have a compound schwa. In the 3fs, he will become a tav, just as we have already seen on the chart dealing with he. So again, these verbs look funny, but they follow the normal rules for weak verbs. Yare also looks like a funny-looking word because of the presence of the se re instead of the expected patak. However, as you glance at the rules, you will notice that both yare and matzah act just like a third aleph, or a lamed aleph verb. The verb is weak, which means that the aleph will quiesce, regardless of what that second vowel is. In yare, it's a sere. In matzah, it's a kametz. Another verb that looks funny is the verb mut, meaning to die. However, the verb is just like kum, another biconsonantal hollow verb, except instead of having a kametz under the first root letter, there is a sere. Patak shows up exactly as expected, and the tav assimilates into the tav of the subject ending, as expected. So again, even though the verb looks funny, it behaves exactly as should be expected. I know there was an awful lot in this particular lesson and a lot of rules that seem very confusing. However, I encourage you to go back and watch this video as many times as necessary until you have a general grasp of what we are talking about. We need to keep in mind that there are several letters which are weak. Gutturals, for instance, words ending in aleph, words ending in he, words ending in nun, biconsonantal verbs, geminate verbs, and yet all of them follow a distinct pattern. If we memorize the pattern of what will happen in the changes, then the changes make sense. Each of the verbs behaves as we would expect according to the rules of its particular weak verb type. So again, go back, learn all of the weak verb rules, study the Quizlets, learn your vocabulary, and I will see you in class.